Jay Hodges and welcome. Before we get started today, I want to take time and just thank you so much for tuning in and for joining us, for sharing these videos with all your friends and families. And to remind you that if you have questions on topics or things that you'd like to have answered, drop them into the comment section and the messaging below, and we'll see what we can do to kind of help you out here. I'm loving doing these interviews, but this isn't about me. This is about us in North America exploring and learning together. So if there are things you want to know about, by all means, reach out and let me know. I'm Jay Hodges again, and I'm welcoming you to Sinn Fein's Talk. Today, we're going to be talking with Chris Hazzard, MP, Member of Parliament from the South Down area. In 2012, Chris was selected by Sinn Fein to be an MLA in Stormont. And then in 2016, he was the Minister of Infrastructure. He's a member of the Gaelic Athletic Association, the GAA, and a PhD candidate at Queen's University. And if all of that wasn't enough to fill his day, he is a happy father of two and the Sinn Fein spokesperson for Brexit, which is what we're going to actually be tackling today. So with all of that in mind, let me welcome Chris. Chris, how are you doing, sir?
Jay, it's great to be here. It's great to speak with you. I'm good, all things considering. Here in Ireland and Europe, we have all turned to Brexit after nearly a year now of COVID. Which has been a huge battle in itself. But so yeah, things are heating up as we head for the end of the transition period this Christmas time and into the life after Brexit, hopefully in January. But yeah, so things are very busy.
Man, one pandemic into another, evidently.
Yeah.
So before we start talking about that, let's set the stage a little bit. Talk about growing up. Talk about kind of your family and your childhood and where you're from and those kinds of things.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, I grew up in rural County Down. I suppose roughly halfway between Belfast and the border. Little place called Drummoness. Fairly typical, I would presume, of many young people's growing up in sort of child of the 1990s. I was born in 1984, but like all my memories in childhood, I suppose, is the 1990s. So, it's the era of Riverdance, it's the era of the USA 94 obviously too, and I suppose it's that time when Ireland as a nation, I suppose, took a step into the Celtic Tiger era. This is the peace process era. My only real memory of the conflict would be the Locket Massacre. No doubt some people will be aware of that, obviously in the context of USA 94 and all. So that would be my only real memory. I have very fond memories of growing up. I was an active member of the GAA, as you said, play for my local club, still play for them when I try and find the time nowadays. And we holidayed every year, mostly in Ireland and in Kerry, usually in and around Killarney. We would have holidayed with great times. And, I was very fortunate, very loving family. It wasn't an overtly Republican family. Certainly Irish identity and culture was very much a part of what we were doing. I would probably describe my upbringing perhaps as a nationalist upbringing, with a strong sense of our own identity, cultural as well as anything. The GAA, following down, for example, meant everything to us. It was very fortunate. They won 2 All-Irelands in the 90s, so it was great times growing up.
Good deal. So then what brought you into Sinn Fein activism?
Well, at a very young age, in primary school, so in P7, I was about 10 years of age. My primary school teacher was a local historian of sorts, and I went to primary school in a town called Ballynahinch, and so that will ring a bell with some people because it was the site of a very famous United Irishman battle in 1798. It was one of the battles alongside Vinegar Hill and Antrim and Saintfield and others, but the United Irishmen took on the Redcoats of the British Army. And we done a history project on it. So, our teacher brought in cannonballs and pike heads. Even in the nearby graveyard, we were taken to see gravestones with the cannons and pikes emblazoned on it. So I suppose for a young 10-year-old, this more or less excited me. This was our version of Braveheart, and this was our version of the likes of The Patriot that was coming into cinema at that time. Where people would have been seeing this. So that sparked an interest in, who were these guys, these United Irishmen. It was the first time I'd ever heard of Tom Paine, the rights of man. And that kind of created the the spark inside me for Republican politics, and made me question, I suppose, what was this all about. And at that same time, then going on to school, and them sort of formative years, that's whenever our politics more or less takes shape. The Republican leadership, Jerry and Martin at that time, were leading a very dynamic party. We were going places then. There was a new confidence about nationalism. There was a new confidence about even the GA came of age in the 1990s. There was a vibrancy and a modernism about the GA that just struck a chord, I think, with my generation. That sense that, of course we're going to wear GA tops into Belfast. Why wouldn't we? We're not second-class citizens. And that all just shaped at a time I wanted to become politically active. And it was obvious there was only one party, a young, aspiring Republican or nationalist would ever join at that time, and that was Sinn Fein.
Now, you're an elected MP, which means that you're elected to represent your constituencies in Westminster. But as most people are aware, Sinn Fein MPs do not take their seats. So can you talk about that, and can you kind of help us understand what that entails and what that really means, and just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, no problem. Well, it's a core tenet of our political values. It dates right back to the foundation of the party in the revolutionary era. And it's of this, and it goes even into our name, Sinn Fein, we ourselves, very much this idea that we don't need a British government to make decisions for us, that they have no authority to do so, they never have and they never will. And that we, the people of Ireland, have the political control and should have the sovereignty to be able to take those decisions for ourselves. So in that light, it's hypocritical of me to step foot into a British Parliament and start taking decisions with regards to British politics, and certainly to participate in a system that still to this day claims sovereignty over part of our island. It is absolutely an anathema to who we are. So as I say, it's a very basic, fundamental tenet of our politics, and one that is just as relevant today. In fact, Brexit probably has really brought it to life again, in that, you see that just like 1918, when the people of Ireland voted for the establishment of a republic, voted for independence, and were ignored and our island were cut in two. In the Brexit referendum in 2016, the people rejected Brexit at the polls in Ireland. There's no mandate for Brexit, but the British government have ignored the democratic desire of the people and are pushing ahead and dragging us out of Europe against their own will. So, ideas of sovereignty and of democracy and national democracy at that are at the very core of who we stand for and who we are.
Now, you brought up Brexit, and that's actually the subject that I really want to get into. And just to give a 10-second cliff note of this, England votes to leave the European Union, which is an organization they've been in since the 70s, and that's fine. It is what it is, but it has massive implications on the North, which is really what I want to ask questions about. So can you talk about just generality, the implications that Brexit does have on Ireland and what that could mean? Can you go into that?
Yeah, no problem. There are similarities in a certain way between how the European Union came to be, actually. And when the founders of the European Union, the belief in the system was, look, if we melt down borders and barriers to friction and of people and movement of trade and goods and labour and all the rest of it, we make Europe a place where people can travel freely, that we will be able for peace to prosper. Something similar happened on the island of Ireland and with Britain, of course, with the Good Friday Agreement. This idea that we could melt down boundaries and borders and frictions, and that identities could be overlapping between our islands, and that people could equally be as British and Irish on the island of Ireland if they so desired, and that we could move freely on our island, that there wouldn't be border infrastructure at the border, that we could move goods freely, that we could move freely as individuals to work in Dublin or work in Belfast, and that this would be the foundation stone for peace and the Good Friday Agreement. And it very much was, and that's where it went to. However, whenever the British government decided on Brexit, this then became a direct challenge, because our peace process always presumed that Britain and Ireland would be member states of the European Union. This is how you avoid the border infrastructure and the ability for people to move freely. So Brexit's a direct challenge to that then.
Now explain to me the hard border, soft border, not only from a historical context, but also from a business, from just a citizen movement context, like, you know, the reality of today, but also the historical on the border question.
Well, if you take where I live and the constituency I represent in South Down, we are a border constituency that goes on to Carlingford Lock. So the other side of the lock is, you know, Carlingford, Omeath, is County Louth, and, you know, which will soon be a European frontier, technically. You know, currently, you know, businesses there can trade freely, and people can come to the north and work for a northern business, or go south and work for a southern business freely each morning. They will never be asked for a passport or identification papers. They can do that very freely, and many people do. In fact, our big hospital in Newry, up to a quarter of the staff and the patients actually come from the south into the north to work or to be treated in that hospital. And that's the same for a variety of businesses along the border corridor, much like you would see perhaps in the States with, you know, with the individual states, you know, people crossing freely and trade being freely movable. So the idea then is that Brexit means that this has to stop. That to a certain extent you will have two jurisdictions. You will have the European Union single market for goods and services, and then you will have what will become a British jurisdiction once again, a harder face of it, and then these free movabilities cease. So that's why the negotiations around preventing that were so important over the last number of years, and ensuring that the peace process took precedence, and that's what we've been able to achieve.
So now, when we say hard border, do you actually mean like an actual like stopped hard border checkpoint?
Yeah. So just like the U.S.-Mexico border or U.S.-Canada border, or, you know, as international borders, as you would presume, as they say, we know that that's simply not acceptable. That was the foundation of our negotiations. After the Brexit vote, we said this isn't acceptable. Thankfully, the European Union agreed with us. The Irish government agreed. The British government also agreed in principle. A number of times they said that they did not want to damage the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process. However, the realities of their policies never met their intentions and rhetoric, and that's where we went wrong. Thankfully, successive US administrations and key political figures, you know, we've seen Joe Biden this week, and Nancy Pelosi, Richie Neal, Peter King and others, bipartisan at all times, have stood up for the peace process as well, because a hard border would be a throwback to the past. Customs infrastructure, you know, checkpoints, all of that type of thing on the border between north and south would be a throwback to a time that none of us want to go back to. And that's where certainly that was the driving force between our negotiations in recent years.
Now, I know that Vice President Biden came out with support of the Good Friday Agreement and Brexit and whatnot. I know also that Congressman Richie Neal, who is a Democrat out of Massachusetts and is the current chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, which handles trade, sent a letter along with his colleague Peter King, who's a Republican out of New York, and said, you know, we're not going to do this if it's going to go back to hard borders. Like, we're not going to do a trade deal if this is what goes on. And it's all tied back into the Good Friday Agreement. Can you explain the Good Friday Agreement and how it pertains particularly to Brexit? Like, what's the connection between the two? So
the Good Friday Agreement was the basis, you know, for the establishment of a local government at Stormont, the establishment of north-south government bodies. So ministers in the south and the Irish government would engage with their counterparts in Belfast on All-Ireland political issues, and also east-west between Belfast, Dublin and London as well. So that laid I suppose the infrastructure of politics on our islands and how it would operate. It established the local assembly, so MLAs, so they're members of the Legislative Assembly. And they work on devolved issues, education, infrastructure, housing, health. All of those matters are all devolved to Belfast, and local politicians look after local issues. What happened with Brexit, however, was the Tories, and you have to understand, these people are nostalgic for empire. They want to somehow return to this project of Britain in the 1950s. You hear them speak of global Britain all the time now. So international trade deals are fundamental to what they've been saying. They've been saying, look, we can leave the European Union and do all these wonderful trade deals with people around the world. Now, in reality, that's simply a lot more difficult than what they suggest. We had Barack Obama, for example, say that, look, in reality, you're going to move to the back of the queue whenever this happens. We've had other nations say, this is a negotiation, this is a trade deal, this, isn't the 1950s, you're not the superpower you maybe once were. So Brexit, to a certain extent, has meant that certain right-wing Tories in England have had to really sober up and realise where they stand in the world nowadays. And I think the soft power that Ireland has been able to wield in recent days, and certainly and throughout this process, has probably shocked some in England, and they don't like that. They don't like to see themselves as a co-equal with European nations, and that's what drives a lot of the jingoism, I suppose, that is behind this. And as I say, there's been a tendency for some racism has crept in. The previous Taoiseach, for example, Leo Varadkar, was on the raw end of racism from some of the British media, which was a throwback to 19th century famine times, whenever the Irish were caricatured in a certain way as well. So that's all been very much part of it. It has been nasty these last couple of years. And now when we look to come towards the end of it, we've had a fairly nasty development in recent weeks again, where the British government have wanted to use our peace process as leverage to get concessions out of Europe. So it's fairly uncertain days at the minute.
So it's the Good Friday Agreement is 35 pages. I tell people all the time, you should read it. You should familiarize yourself with it. But if there is any success that is small or great out of the Good Friday Agreement, the fact that in our current United States political climate, you got two people from opposite parties to actually sit down and say, guys, you need to understand, like, we're not going to do what you think we're going to do because we support this agreement that has been guiding principle for the better part of 20 years now. I think that is actually just a very beautiful thing, but that's a personal side note. So explain to me then, Brexit is a really complex issue. I mean, it's not as simple as what a 30-second news broadcast or anything else can really go into. What is one thing about Brexit that is either misunderstood or that people don't really understand to begin with, that you kind of point to and say, this is what I'm looking at right now? Like, you're in the weeds, and there are a few experts as good as you are on this subject matter. So what is it that you see that other people just don't or are not able to?
Well, there's so many different levels of this, you're right. It's very complex, but even on the simple stuff that matters, if you take young people, young students, for example, there have been programs where our young students could travel throughout Europe and study throughout European colleges, the Erasmus program. There has been funding streams for university called Horizon that have brought big European funds in for research projects that's really propelled our local universities and our students into the heart of European life. That all ends. Come the 31st of December, that ends, and our young people don't qualify anymore for that. So that cuts.
Students who are currently out. Well, if I'm a sophomore in college and I'm going into my junior year, like, what happens to me then?
Well, that opportunity to be able to participate in those schemes ends. The British government have pledged that they're going to come up with their own schemes, but we've yet to see any detail. And universities have spoken at large already of saying, this is just such a retrograde step. When you look at the world of business, some big businesses in my constituency, as I say, around the border corridor, are already making plans to relocate to the south of Ireland to remain within the European Union. You know, the free movement of EU nationals is very important to their business model. Supply chains, for example, for their raw materials, they don't want to have to pay, you know, the additional burdens when it comes to paperwork and all the rest of it. So it's just, it makes life so much more complicated in one sense, even away from all the politics. And then, of course, the politics of it all is, I'm an Irish passport holder. I very much view myself as an EU citizen with EU rights. However, I can't vote for an EU MEP in an EU election any longer.
What's an MEP?
An MEP is a member of the European Parliament. So
okay.
Anybody who, you know, for European countries then who elect members to the European Parliament. So in the North now, we don't have that voice in Europe anymore when it comes to issues on, you know, the big issues that Europe might take a stand on in the future, such as the humanitarian crisis around refugees or the climate change crisis, all these big issues that are cross-cutting across Europe. We no longer don't have that voice because of the British government's decision.
Now, there are people who say, well, Sinn Fein doesn't take their seats in Parliament. And if they would just take their seats, like they could have held this off, they could have saved the day or whatever. How do you respond to that? What is that? Is that actually real?
Yeah, well, I say to people, and I get that all the time here, you know, if I'm walking about and I'm talking to constituents, somebody will say, you know, you should be there in London, being able to make your voice heard. And the first thing I'd say is, I do be in London. I have an office in Westminster. I meet the British Prime Minister at occasions. I have met the last two British Prime Ministers. I met Boris Johnson in the last number of weeks. We meet all the political parties in Britain. We do a range of briefings with diplomats and ambassadors from around the world. The one thing that we do not do is go into the chamber and take part in the theatre and of the political discussions that take place, is for the reasons that I outlined at the start. And for those reasons, and the real crux of this is, and even the former Lib Dem leader, Nick Clegg, who was a very adamant pro-Remainer, said, you know, the last thing that those opposed to Brexit wanted to see was Irish rebels and Sinn Fein coming walking into the Westminster chamber. You know, those people who were opposed to Brexit, they wouldn't have wanted to stand in the same voting lobbies as us. So they were very much of the understanding that, you know, that we would not make that impact in there. And plus, every single MP who travels from the north of Ireland over, there's 18 MPs in total. You know, that wouldn't have made a difference. We could have had 10 votes each, and that still wouldn't have made a difference. Boris Johnson has a voting majority of over 80 now, and when it comes to them votes, it's the interests of the Tory party, it's the interests of the British political establishment. That's the only interest that sway things. Ireland has never been an issue that has ever swayed the decision of the British Parliament, nor should it be. At the end of the day, the British Parliament is for the British people. We want to see the situation where we have a national parliament looking after the interests of our national interests.
Well, I want to take a minute and say thank you again for talking with us and sharing your knowledge and whatnot. I hope that there is not a reason to talk to you again about this subject matter, but I have a very strange feeling that there is going to be several reasons to talk to you.
Yeah.
So I'd very much like to keep an open line of communication and have you back, and you know, as this continues to progress and keep talking about it. As we kind of move more towards closure and whatnot, what advice do you have to anyone watching right now in North America? Like what do you say to them about what's happening in Ireland?
Well, I think political life in Ireland, and certainly in Europe and in the north of Ireland, maybe in particular, has been very uncertain and unstable in recent years. I think the British government decision to, as I say, chase after those nostalgic dreams of empire over the last number of years has had really toxic consequences for our peace process and our politics. We need to be very wary when it comes to populist politics, when it comes to, you know, them very dangerous fumes of racism and xenophobia and extreme nationalism at times as presents big dangers, not just, as I said, with Brexit, but in parts of Europe and other parts of the world. I think we need to all be much more measured when it comes to our politics and much more considerate. I think Europe is looking in, for example, on the Black Lives Matter stuff that's happening in America at the minute with, you know, great interest. Even in Britain, this has presented big issues for the British political establishment as well. And there's been a real conversation now even about, you know, the legacy of colonialism, and that's really featuring in European and British politics now too. So I think we live in really interesting times. You know, if you look at Ireland, for example, you know, the desire for, you know, Irish reunification is stronger now than in any time, certainly in my lifetime. Brexit has been an accelerant in that. People are fed up with, you know, the British political establishment making decisions for us. They want back in Europe. They want to be able to be in control of our own destination. So, as I say, it's all to play for. You know, the constitutional chips have been thrown up in the air. Nobody knows where they're going to land. So, you know, my message, I suppose, to anybody watching is get involved. You know, Irish America has always played a very constructive and proactive part in the campaign for Irish freedom, and long may that last.
I appreciate that. Now, my last question is the one I ask everybody. I'm an avid reader. I love your backdrop. I think that's an amazing thing. What is the one book that you would recommend people read, or the one video that people watch, or the one album that, you know, what is it that you would say to anyone that wants to learn more? Man, this is my recommendation. What's your recommendation?
Well, I suppose before I mention the book, I listened to a brilliant podcast, Revolutionary Ireland, Lorcan Collins, 1916 Walking Tours in Dublin. Yeah. A fantastic podcast, you know, bringing to life, you know, issues such as James Connolly, the recent, you know, the Connacht Rangers mutiny, lots of different stuff of late that I think is fascinating insight into our revolutionary history. But I suppose the book, and I'd hold it up, Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor, a real examination, an exploration of what the British Empire did to the people of India, and through colonialism. I think it's a really timely read. Certainly it brings to life some of the horrors of colonialism, and I think of where we need to go now as a modern world, and facing up to some of those decisions that some of the powers had and the policies that just left devastation behind them. And very often, you know, we're still picking up the pieces, and I say we as, you know, Europe and the Western world, of the damage what has been done for generations and decades and centuries, in fact. And some of that, I think, is coming to life now. When you see the great power over the summer months of, you know, statues being pulled down, for example, throughout Britain, King Leopold being pulled down in Belgium, I think, you know, the world at the minute, there's a sign of something else being able to be born. And I think we all need to get involved to ensure it's the right type of world and that we don't slip back and the wrong type of people come to the fore and create the sort of environment we're going to live in the years ahead.
Man, I look forward to adding that to my reading list. That's awesome. That's really impressive. So, hey, thanks again for coming in and talking with us, man. I certainly hope you the best sanity that I can hope for you right now, because this sounds like it's a crazy time. But, you know, we will look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, look, Jay, thanks very much for the invite. Anytime. I've always enjoyed engaging with yourselves, and I was over in Buffalo not so long ago for the AOH convention, and it was great. It's great to be able to stay involved and have conversations. As I said earlier, you know, political voices and friends and colleagues in America have always been very important to us, and long may that last.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So again, we want to say thank you to Chris, and then encourage everyone to share these videos, to push them around. I always say this, but I always truly, truly mean it. You know, the one guy that is a diehard Irish American or a diehard Irish Canadian that would really enjoy these videos and enjoy learning more. Stay in touch, become a friend of Sinn Fein. Please stay safe, please stay sane, and we will look forward to seeing you next time.